Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. It's me, and as we come to close on the end of this series comparing Breath and Tears, I thought it would be fitting to compare Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom's replayability, which Microsoft Word was kind enough to inform me isn't actually a word. It should be though, because I'm pretty sure there isn't another word for that. Anyway, I know that replayability isn't at the top of most people's lists of questions or concerns regarding either of these games. Some of y'all haven't finished your first playthrough of Tears of the Kingdom yet, and many who have beat it have just continued to mess around in your existing save file instead of jumping right into a second playthrough, which there's obviously nothing wrong with. But jumping into a second playthrough is exactly what I did, so as one of the few who has already done so, I figured I'd quick throw together this video for those of you who are wondering what it's like to replay each of these games. I haven't finished either of my second playthroughs just yet, but I'm at least a third of the way through each one, and I can give you an idea of what kinds of ups and downs you're likely to experience with these games on a second go around. Now for this video, I will just say straight up that playing Tears of the Kingdom a second time is pretty rough compared to playing Breath of the Wild a second time. Now, I did, in the case of both of these games, start up a new save file just weeks after beating them for the first time, so all of the problems that come with playing a game the second time here are going to be knocked up to 11, so take what I say with a grain of salt. Okay, so like many of these comparison videos, let's look at what these games have in common first. Both Breath and Tears revolve heavily around exploration and discovery, not just with regards to the geography, but also with regards to the story and mechanics of each game. Obviously, on the second playthrough, you already know a good chunk of each game's secrets, so while you may make some new discoveries on a second playthrough, the element of exploration is largely missing on subsequent playthroughs, so you do have to go out of your way to find your fun in either game through other things. A second thing that I found in each game on a replay is that difficulty is a huge problem. The difficulty of both Breath and Tears is meant to be approachable for a wide variety of players, but this means that if you've played either game to the end before, you're going to steamroll them on subsequent playthroughs. There's no traditional difficulty settings in either game, so it's not like you can just slide the difficulty up a few notches. And yeah, I know there's Master Mode, we'll get to that in a bit. Now, this is something that can be solved if you're willing to limit yourself in-game. I would seriously recommend that if you intend to replay either of these games, you basically treat it like a challenge run, and just set some parameters that you won't cross. My recommended parameters for both games would be no armor upgrades and no extra health outside of the mandatory dungeon containers. In my experience, this has been enough to keep each game moderately challenging and much more enjoyable. Other rules you could consider implementing if you want a bigger challenge would be no healing mid-combat and no Korok seeds. Just a couple of ideas. Now, there are upsides to a second playthrough as well. Now that you've played through Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom and have explored their mechanics a little bit, you're now ready to abuse them a little bit. Tears of the Kingdom's Ultra Hand rune allows for nearly infinite combinations, and you will likely find yourself looking for new applications of the crafting system outside of just vehicles and war machines. Breath of the Wild, on the other hand, has some of the most fun ways to abuse the physics system out of any game I've seen, including, but definitely not limited to, techniques such as wind bombing, bow lift smuggling, and bullet time bouncing, none of which require more than a few seconds of setup in-game, and most of which can be learned with some patience by a majority of casual players. Technically, those are weaknesses in programming for Breath of the Wild, but I propose that it is okay if the game is a little bit easier than normal to break. It's things like these for both games that I think make second playthroughs a lot of fun. Now, I suppose I should point out the differences in how it is to replay each of these games individually. For Breath of the Wild, I really only have one thing to mention, and that is Master Mode. While I have yet to try out Master Mode myself, I certainly intend to because it takes care of the lack of difficulty options. When Breath of the Wild was released, it didn't have difficulty options, same as Tears, but this DLC edition did provide a hard mode, so that is a point in favor of Breath of the Wild. Tears of the Kingdom also has one upside in its favor, and that's the sheer amount of content in the game. I think it's safe to say that most people won't do every last shrine or side quest in Tears on their first playthrough, so even when replaying, there's a chance to do much more stuff for the first time than there is in Breath. However, Tears also has some problems with replaying, but what most of those problems boil down to is that it is comparatively sluggish. Tears takes much longer to play through than Breath, and on a replay, you can feel that it's dragged out a bit. In no place is this more obvious than in the starting areas. On my second playthroughs, Breath of the Wild starting area took me an hour and 5 minutes, whereas Tears of the Kingdom starting area took me an hour and 37 minutes. And I have felt every one of those extra 22 minutes, because at the end of the day, neither tutorial teaches you that much more than the other, but one does take longer. This general pattern continues on into the dungeon quest lines and the rest of the main quests as a whole. I talked about some of this in my dungeons video, about how the quests leading up to each dungeon take a lot longer in Tears than in Breath, and that's not a bad thing necessarily, especially on a first playthrough, but I found it to result in some large sections of tedium in subsequent playthroughs of Tears. So if you've played both of these games once and are wanting to replay one or the other, I would highly recommend starting with Breath of the Wild. I find that it doesn't hold you back as much with its quest progression, and you do have an alternative difficulty option if you own the DLC. And that's all I've got. This is a relatively short video for the Breath vs. Tears series, but I hope you found it useful. Have a nice day.